What if everything you've been taught about money, spirituality, and abundance has been a carefully constructed lie designed to keep you small? What if the very beliefs you've held sacred about humility, poverty, and spiritual purity are actually the invisible chains preventing you from experiencing your true divine inheritance? But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. Today, we're diving deep into a revolutionary text that challenges every assumption you've ever made about wealth, scarcity, and what it truly means to live an abundant life. This isn't another self-help book promising quick riches or manifestation techniques. No. What we're exploring goes far deeper. It's a complete dismantling of the spiritual programming that has kept humanity trapped in cycles of limitation for centuries. Has this ever happened to you? You've worked on your mindset. You've practiced gratitude. You've even seen some success in your life. Yet there's still this underlying anxiety about money. This persistent feeling that wanting more somehow makes you less spiritual. That internal conflict isn't accidental. It's the result of thousands of years of conditioning that has taught us to associate divine connection with material sacrifice. The author of Accustomed to God presents a startling revelation. The idea that gold corrupts and desire is inherently impure wasn't written by God. These concepts were created by people who simply didn't understand how to live abundantly without becoming enslaved by their possessions. Think about that for a moment. We've been following spiritual teachings about money that came from those who never mastered the balance themselves. What you're about to discover might surprise you, because this work suggests that poverty isn't a virtue to be celebrated, but rather a form of spiritual exile. It argues that when we accept scarcity as our reality, we're not being humble, we're actually betraying our divine heritage. The book presents the radical idea that our souls weren't designed for limitation, but for expansion, and that every time we settle for less than what we intuitively know is possible, we're committing a form of invisible apostasy against our own divine nature. Stay with me until the end, because what we're uncovering here will fundamentally shift how you view the relationship between spirituality and material abundance. This isn't about becoming greedy or materialistic. It's about understanding that the material world was never meant to be our master, but rather our canvas for divine expression. The text reveals how scarcity operates not just as an external condition, but as an internal architecture, a vibrational structure that shapes our reality from the inside out. It shows us how poverty begins as language, becomes behavior, and eventually crystallizes as identity. Every phrase like "money doesn't grow on trees" or "it's better to be poor but honest" acts as a hypnotic formula, programming our souls to accept limitation as normal. But here's where it gets fascinating. The book doesn't just diagnose the problem, it provides a pathway to what it calls becoming accustomed to God. This isn't about religious dogma or traditional prayer practices. It's about remembering that abundance is our natural state, that we were designed to be channels of divine prosperity, not beggars hoping for scraps. The journey we're about to embark on together will challenge everything you think you know about worthiness, deserving, and what it means to live a truly spiritual life. We'll explore how the soul that has remembered its divine origin operates not from need, but from overflow, not from asking, but from allowing. Are you ready to discover what happens when a soul stops seeking God and starts remembering that it was never separate from the divine source in the first place? Because what unfolds next will show you exactly how to break free from the invisible structures that have kept you living smaller than your true design. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because what we're about to explore represents one of the most profound transformations a human consciousness can undergo. The text speaks of something it calls the death of the limited identity, and this isn't some metaphorical concept. It's describing a very real, process that must occur before genuine abundance can flow through your life. If these conversations speak to something real in your consciousness, if you're ready for content that honors the depth of your spiritual journey, then subscribing to this channel is your way of saying yes to more of these transmissions. Every video here is designed to support souls who are serious about remembering their divine nature. Think about this for a moment. Every day you wake up and step into a version of yourself that has been carefully constructed over years of conditioning. This identity is the one that says, I need this, I deserve that, I must work harder to earn more, or I should be grateful for what little I have. But what if this entire identity, this person you've believed yourself to be, is actually the primary obstacle standing between you and the life you're meant to live? The hidden truth behind most spiritual and personal development approaches is that they try to improve this limited identity rather than helping you recognize that it was never real in the first place. They teach you to think more positively, to affirm your worth, to visualize your goals, but they're essentially trying to polish a mirage. The real transformation happens when you realize that the you who has been struggling, striving, and seeking was always just a character in a story you inherited but never chose. This journey of awakening reveals something remarkable. The divine doesn't exist. Somewhere out there, waiting for you to become worthy enough to access it. Instead, what needs to happen is a complete embodiment of what you already are at the deepest level. It's not about reaching up to touch something higher. It's about allowing what has always been present to finally express itself without the interference of centuries of programming that told you to stay small. The most fascinating aspect of this process is how it dismantles what the text calls vibrational structures of limitation. These aren't just thoughts or beliefs, they're energetic patterns that have become so deeply embedded in your consciousness that they operate like invisible software, automatically generating the same experiences over and over again. Every time you catch yourself thinking, I can't afford that, or that's not for people like me, you're witnessing these structures in action. But here's where the real revelation occurs. These mental habits that you've mistaken for reality, for practical wisdom, for just how life works, are actually cutting you off from your natural ability to create and manifest. The goal isn't to accumulate more possessions or even to attract more money into your life. The true aim is far more profound. It's to remember who you really are beneath all the conditioning, to recognize yourself as the source of creation rather than someone who must constantly seek and struggle for what they need. When this recognition dawns, something extraordinary begins to shift in your entire experience of reality. You stop looking outside yourself for validation, for opportunities, for the next breakthrough that will finally make you feel complete. Instead, you begin to operate from a place of such deep knowing that what you need simply appears, not because you've manipulated the universe into giving it to you, but because you've remembered that you and the universe were never separate in the first place. This isn't some mystical fantasy. It's describing a very practical reordering of how consciousness operates. When you're no longer identified with the limited self that needs, asks, deserves, and climbs, you naturally begin to function as a clear channel for creative expression. Ideas flow more easily, opportunities present themselves naturally, and resources align without force or manipulation. The impact of this transformation extends far beyond your personal circumstances. When someone embodies this level of remembering, their very presence begins to alter the energy of every room they enter, every conversation they participate in, every decision they make. They're no longer trying to get something from life. They've become conduits through which life expresses its infinite creativity. Now I want to explore how this remembering actually happens in practical terms, because understanding the mechanics of this transformation is crucial for anyone serious about breaking free from limitation. Write in the comments, I'm ready for this transformation. If this resonates with your own inner knowing about what's possible, the mechanics of this transformation begin with understanding something that completely revolutionizes how we perceive poverty and abundance. Most people believe that poverty is simply about not having enough money, but this surface-level understanding keeps us trapped in an endless cycle of external seeking. The hidden truth that changes everything is this: poverty is actually a state of disconnection from your source, and once you truly grasp this distinction, your entire approach to creating abundance shifts dramatically. Consider the profound implications of this revelation. There are people with vast material wealth who live in a constant state of internal poverty, always anxious about losing what they have, never feeling truly secure, constantly comparing themselves to others. Conversely, there are those with very little in terms of possessions who radiate a sense of completeness and contentment that seems almost magical to observers. The difference isn't in their bank accounts, it's in their level of connection to something greater than their circumstances. When someone becomes truly accustomed to operating from this divine connection, something remarkable happens. They stop needing anything external to feel complete. This doesn't mean they become passive or stop engaging with the material world. Instead, they begin to interact with resources, opportunities, and even money itself from a position of overflow rather than scarcity. They contain within themselves everything they could ever need, not because they've accumulated it, but because they've remembered their true nature as channels of infinite creative potential. That like button represents more than appreciation. It's your energetic agreement with everything we've explored together. When you click it, you're affirming that this level of spiritual conversation deserves to reach other souls who are ready for these truths. This understanding exposes one of the most devastating illusions of our time: the belief that scarcity is primarily about external conditions. What we're really dealing with is what could be called soul exile, a condition where consciousness has become so identified with limitation that it literally cannot perceive the abundance that surrounds it. It's like being in a room full of food while convinced you're starving simply because you've forgotten how to see. The deepest tragedy isn't material lack. It's when a soul becomes so accustomed to poverty consciousness that this limited identity becomes comfortable, familiar, even protective. This is where the real work of transformation must focus, because no amount of external change can create lasting abundance when the internal architecture remains oriented towards scarcity. Behind the scenes of every authentic transformation story, you'll find this same pattern. Someone reached a point where they could no longer tolerate living as an exile from their own divinity. The shift wasn't about learning new techniques or strategies. It was about returning home to a truth they had always known but somehow forgotten. This journey back to remembering requires incredible courage, because it means releasing every story, every excuse, every reason we've held onto for why abundance isn't possible for us. The most fascinating aspect of this process is how it impacts decision-making. When you're operating from soul exile, every choice is filtered through the question, can I afford this? Or do I deserve this? But when consciousness remembers its divine connection, decisions begin flowing from an entirely different place. Instead of asking, how can I get what I need, the question becomes, what wants to express itself through me? This shift in perspective creates what might seem like miraculous changes in external circumstances, but what's really happening is that consciousness has aligned with its natural creative capacity. Resources begin flowing not because the universe has suddenly decided to be generous, but because the internal barriers that were blocking this natural flow have dissolved. Understanding this distinction between material lack and spiritual disconnection becomes the foundation for every lasting transformation. When someone truly grasps that their experience of scarcity has nothing to do with external conditions and everything to do with their level of remembering, they can begin the real work of returning to their authentic power. Now, I want to explore exactly how this soul exile happens in the first place, because understanding the mechanism that creates disconnection is essential for anyone serious about permanent liberation from limitation. Write in the comments, "Soul exile describes my experience," if you recognize this pattern in your own journey. The mechanism behind soul exile reveals one of the most profound secrets about how reality actually operates. What most people don't realize is that the visible world around us, everything we can touch, measure, and experience, is essentially composed of solidified thoughts. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. Before these thoughts even form, there's something deeper at work. Before thought comes desire, and before desire comes what we might call an internal image of being. This image, this fundamental picture you hold of who you are and what's possible for you, is the invisible architect of your entire experience. The revelation that changes everything is recognizing that this internal image has become distorted over time, creating what appears to be reality, but is actually an elaborate prison of perception. Think about this carefully. If your deepest held image of yourself is one of limitation, struggle, and scarcity, then no matter what external changes you try to make, you'll keep recreating experiences that confirm this distorted self-perception. It's like having a corrupted blueprint that keeps producing the same flawed structure over and over again. This distortion doesn't happen overnight. It's the result of what ancient texts describe as a fall from an original vibrational position. The Book of Enoch tells the story of the Watchers, celestial beings who descended from their elevated state and became corrupted. This isn't just mythology. It's a precise description of what happens to human consciousness when it adopts a vision of itself as lacking, separated, and powerless. The fall isn't a punishment, it's a natural consequence of forgetting one's true nature. What makes this understanding so transformative is the recognition that scarcity consciousness is learned ignorance, not inherent truth. Every limiting belief you've accepted about money, success, worthiness, or possibility was programmed into your awareness through repetition and reinforcement. Since it was learned, it can be unlearned. The prison exists only in perception, and perception can be shifted. Behind the scenes of this programming process, something fascinating occurs. Each time you accept a limitation as truth, each time you repeat phrases like, "I can't afford that," or "people like me don't get those opportunities," you're literally reshaping your internal image of being. You're training your consciousness to see itself as small, separate, and dependent on external circumstances for validation and survival. The impact of this distorted self-image extends far beyond personal circumstances. It affects every decision you make, every opportunity you notice or ignore, every relationship you form, and every goal you set or abandon. When your fundamental image of being is rooted in limitation, you unconsciously filter out possibilities that don't match this identity. You literally cannot see options that would be obvious to someone operating from a different internal blueprint. The journey back to your original vibrational position begins with recognizing that what you've accepted as normal, the struggle, the anxiety about money, the constant feeling of not having enough, is actually evidence of how far consciousness has fallen from its natural state. In your original design, abundance wasn't something you had to strive for. It was simply the natural expression of being aligned with your source. The people who find their way to this channel aren't here by accident. You're part of a consciousness that's awakening to its true abundance. By subscribing, you're joining a community of souls who refuse to accept limitation as normal and are committed to living from their authentic spiritual identity. Understanding this mechanism reveals why so many transformation attempts fail. Most approaches try to change external circumstances while leaving the distorted internal image intact. It's like trying to fix a broken movie by adjusting the screen instead of replacing the damaged film, until the fundamental image of being is restored to its original clarity. Any external changes will be temporary at best. The most profound realization in this entire process is discovering that your current experience of limitation isn't who you really are. It's simply who you've been trained to be. Every moment of scarcity, every feeling of not having enough, every experience of being excluded from abundance is evidence of learned ignorance, not inherent truth about your nature or capabilities. Now, I want to examine exactly how this programming gets installed in the first place, because understanding the transmission mechanism is crucial for anyone determined to break free from inherited limitations. Write in the comments, "I see the distortion now," if you're beginning to recognize how this internal image has been shaping your reality. The transmission mechanism behind this programming reveals one of the most sophisticated forms of mind control ever implemented, and it operates through something most people never question: the cultural association between spirituality and poverty. For centuries, humanity has been systematically conditioned to believe that connecting with the divine requires renunciation, that purity somehow equals precarity, and that true humility means accepting limitation as a virtue. But here's the revelation that shatters this entire framework. These associations aren't divine truth. They're cultural artifice, carefully constructed and sustained through generations of misinterpretation. Think about the profound impact of this programming on your own mindset. From childhood, you've likely been exposed to stories, teachings, and examples that reinforce the idea that wanting material abundance somehow makes you less spiritual. Religious imagery often portrays saints in rags, spiritual teachers taking vows of poverty, and the wealthy as spiritually corrupt. This creates a devastating internal conflict where your natural desire for expansion and abundance feels like a betrayal of your higher self. Behind the scenes of this cultural conditioning lies what ancient traditions call avidya, a form of spiritual ignorance that's far more dangerous than simple lack of knowledge. True spiritual ignorance isn't about not knowing something. It's about knowing the false as if it were absolutely true. When souls accept as unquestionable reality that they were born to struggle for every coin, to justify every desire, to feel guilty about wanting more, they enter what can only be described as spiritual bondage. The hidden truth that transforms everything is recognizing that this entire paradigm was created by systems that benefited from keeping people small, dependent, and resigned to limitation. When you truly examine the origins of these teachings, you discover that they weren't transmitted by enlightened beings who had mastered abundance. They came from institutions that needed controllable populations. A soul that believes it's virtuous to want less is much easier to manage than one that remembers its divine inheritance. This programming operates through incredibly subtle mechanisms. Every time someone says, "Money is the root of all evil," or "Blessed are the poor," without understanding the deeper context, they're reinforcing neural pathways that create resistance to abundance. Every story that glorifies suffering as spiritual growth, every teaching that suggests wanting material comfort is somehow selfish, every example that portrays the wealthy as automatically corrupt, all of these work together to create an internal architecture that literally cannot receive abundance without feeling guilty about it. The journey toward authentic transformation requires recognizing that what you've been taught to call spiritual humility might actually be learned helplessness in disguise. True humility isn't about making yourself small or accepting less than what your soul knows is possible. Real humility is recognizing yourself as a channel for divine expression, which naturally includes abundance in all its forms. What makes this realization so revolutionary is understanding that the divine doesn't operate through scarcity. Creation itself is an expression of infinite abundance. Every star, every galaxy, every living system demonstrates expansion, multiplication, and generous overflow. The idea that connecting with this creative force requires poverty is not only illogical, it's a complete inversion of how divinity actually operates in the universe. The impact of breaking free from this programming extends far beyond personal circumstances. When you stop associating spirituality with limitation, when you cease believing that wanting abundance makes you less connected to Source, your entire energy field shifts. Decisions that once felt impossible become natural choices. Opportunities that were invisible suddenly become obvious. Resources that seemed unavailable begin flowing toward you with surprising ease. Now I want to explore exactly how this false knowledge gets so deeply embedded that it becomes invisible, because understanding the installation process is essential for anyone serious about complete liberation from inherited limitation. Write in the comments, "I reject false programming," if you're ready to release these cultural distortions from your consciousness. The installation process of this false programming operates through one of the most insidious mechanisms known to human psychology, the normalization of abnormal conditions until they become invisible. What isn't questioned eventually becomes habit, and when habits operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, they transform into what can only be described as psychic laws, unbreakable rules that govern behavior without the person even realizing they exist. This reveals a startling truth about poverty that completely reframes how we understand limitation. The poorest people aren't necessarily those who lack material goods. They're those who have grown so accustomed to lacking that they've created an internal architecture of limitation that operates automatically. Their consciousness has been structured to expect less, to settle for inadequate conditions, and to feel uncomfortable when abundance appears. They've become psychologically allergic to their own expansion. Consider the profound implications of this revelation. When someone has lived with scarcity for so long that it feels normal, their nervous system literally adapts to limitation as if it were the natural order. Any movement toward abundance triggers internal alarms because it contradicts the established identity. This is why lottery winners often return to poverty, why people sabotage their own success just as breakthrough moments arrive, and why many individuals feel guilty or anxious when good things happen to them. Behind the scenes of this psychological conditioning lies something even more disturbing: the systematic elevation of suffering into theological doctrine. What we're witnessing in modern spiritual culture is the result of centuries of carefully constructed teaching that transformed pain into virtue, struggle into sanctity, and economic sacrifice into a pathway to divine connection. When suffering becomes doctrine, freedom automatically becomes heresy. This transformation didn't happen accidentally. Millions of people have been deliberately educated to distrust their natural desire for expansion, to associate the divine with economic deprivation, and to believe that wanting material comfort somehow separates them from spiritual truth. This entire pedagogical system was designed for control, not liberation, because souls that feel guilty about their desires are much easier to manage than those who remember their divine right to abundance. The hidden truth that changes everything is recognizing how this theology of suffering operates in your own mindset. Every time you catch yourself thinking, "I shouldn't want that," "I don't need much to be happy," or "money complicates spiritual life," you're witnessing these programmed responses in action. These aren't your authentic thoughts. They're inherited beliefs that have been installed so thoroughly they feel like your own wisdom. What makes this programming so effective is its ability to disguise itself as virtue. The person who has been conditioned to accept limitation doesn't see themselves as oppressed. Indeed, they see themselves as enlightened, humble, and spiritually evolved. They genuinely believe that their resistance to abundance demonstrates higher consciousness, when in reality, it demonstrates successful conditioning. The journey toward authentic freedom requires recognizing that questioning these normalized limitations isn't selfish or unspiritual. It's an act of rebellion against systems designed to keep consciousness small. When you begin to examine why you feel guilty about wanting more, why you apologize for success, why you diminish your achievements to make others comfortable, you're uncovering layers of programming that were never meant to serve your highest good. The impact of breaking free from these psychic laws extends into every area of life. Decisions that once felt impossible become natural choices. Relationships shift as you stop apologizing for your expansion. Career opportunities multiply as you release the need to stay small for others' comfort. Even your physical health improves as the stress of constantly constraining your natural impulses dissolves. Now I want to examine how this theology of suffering specifically targets desire itself, because understanding how your natural impulses have been weaponized against you is crucial for reclaiming your authentic creative power. Write in the comments, I question the normalization, if you're ready to examine these invisible psychic laws operating in your own consciousness. The weaponization of desire operates through a devastating mechanism that targets the very core of human creative power. The hidden truth that most people never discover is that poverty isn't part of any divine plan. It's simply the natural result of living disconnected from source. But here's where this understanding becomes truly transformative. This disconnection doesn't persist because people can't reconnect. It continues because disconnection becomes comfortable, offering the seductive reward of not having to change. Think about the profound psychology behind this revelation. When someone has been living in limitation for years, their entire identity becomes organized around that experience. Their friendships are often built on shared complaints about money. Their conversations revolve around what they can't afford. Their daily decisions are filtered through scarcity consciousness. Even their spiritual practices become focused on coping with lack rather than creating abundance. To suddenly shift into connection with infinite source would require dismantling this entire architecture of identity. If this content has shifted something in your awareness, if you feel like you've been part of a real spiritual transmission rather than just watching a video, then hitting that like tells the universe you're ready for more of this frequency in your life. The journey toward authentic transformation reveals something most people aren't prepared to face. The soul that has grown accommodated to scarcity has made a fundamental substitution that seems safer than growth. They've traded possibility for permanence, expansion for predictability, creative power for comfortable limitation. What appears to be resignation is actually a sophisticated defense mechanism against the terror of assuming responsibility for their own experience. Behind the scenes of this psychological dynamic lies one of the most profound fears in human consciousness, the fear of assuming personal power. When someone truly understands that their experience of scarcity is a result of disconnection rather than divine decree, they're suddenly faced with an uncomfortable reality. They have far more influence over their circumstances than they've been willing to acknowledge. This recognition brings both liberation and terror in equal measure. The impact of this realization explains why so many people unconsciously sabotage their own progress toward abundance. Every attempt at expansion triggers internal alarms because leaving scarcity implies taking responsibility for choosing and discerning. It means acknowledging that many of the limitations they've accepted weren't imposed by external circumstances, but were actually choices made from a place of unconscious safety seeking. What makes this dynamic so challenging is how expansion can feel like aggression against the familiar self. When someone begins to desire more, to envision greater possibilities, to take actions aligned with abundance, there's often an internal voice that labels these impulses as selfish, unrealistic, or even sinful. This isn't spiritual guidance. It's the ego's attempt to maintain the known territory of limitation because the unknown territory of empowerment feels dangerous. The hidden truth that changes everything is recognizing that this internal resistance isn't protecting you from anything real. It's protecting you from your own power. The comfortable disconnection from source isn't actually comfortable. It's numbing. It creates the illusion of safety while slowly draining the life force that could be creating miracles. The permanence of limitation isn't actually stable. It's stagnant, preventing the natural flow of creative energy that wants to express itself through your life. Understanding this mechanism reveals why traditional approaches to overcoming poverty often fail. Most methods try to convince people they deserve more or teach them to think positively about money, but they don't address the fundamental terror of leaving the known world of scarcity for the unknown realm of personal responsibility and creative power. Until this fear is acknowledged and transformed, any movement toward abundance will trigger unconscious resistance. The most profound shift occurs when someone recognizes that assuming personal power isn't about becoming arrogant or separated from divine guidance. It's about becoming a conscious collaborator with creative force instead of an unconscious victim of circumstances. This collaboration doesn't eliminate divine connection. It fulfills it by allowing source energy to flow through an awakened consciousness rather than a defended one. Now I want to explore what happens when someone finally breaks through this resistance and begins operating from true personal power, because understanding the mechanics of authentic empowerment is essential for anyone ready to leave limitation behind permanently. Write in the comments, "I choose expansion over safety," if you're willing to face the responsibility that comes with your own creative power. The mechanics of authentic empowerment reveal a crucial distinction that completely transforms how we understand the relationship between spirituality and material experience. There's a profound difference between voluntary simplicity and enforced limitation, and recognizing this difference is essential for anyone seeking genuine freedom. The soul that consciously chooses simplicity from a place of fullness isn't impoverished. It's actually demonstrating the highest form of freedom. But here's the revelation that changes everything. The problem was never about having little. It's about being unable to have more without drowning in self-blame, guilt, and internal conflict. This distinction exposes one of the most sophisticated forms of spiritual bypassing in modern consciousness. Many people convince themselves they're choosing simplicity when they're actually trapped in limitation, unable to expand without feeling like they're betraying some higher principle. True voluntary simplicity comes from a place of genuine choice, where someone could have more but consciously decides they don't need it. Enforced limitation masquerades as choice, while actually being driven by fear, conditioning, and internal prohibition against expansion. Behind the scenes of this confusion lies a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of divine design itself. When you examine the actual structure of creation, not the stories we've been told about it, but the observable patterns that govern everything from quantum particles to galaxies, you discover something remarkable. Every seed is programmed to become a tree. Every star is designed to radiate light across vast distances. Every living cell naturally seeks to multiply and expand. This isn't random. It's the fundamental impulse of existence itself. The hidden truth that transforms everything is recognizing that the human soul operates according to this same divine programming. You weren't designed for limitation, contraction, or making yourself small to fit other people's comfort zones. The ancient Zoroastrian texts capture this perfectly. The righteous multiplies like light because he has remembered the source of his flame. This isn't about accumulating possessions. It's about allowing your authentic nature to express itself without internal resistance. What makes this understanding so revolutionary is how it reframes every moment of self-limitation as a violation of natural law. When you catch yourself thinking you shouldn't want more, shouldn't dream bigger, shouldn't expand beyond your current circumstances, you're witnessing conditioning that directly contradicts your divine programming. It's like watching a seed apologize for wanting to grow, or a star dimming its light to avoid outshining other stars. The journey toward authentic transformation requires recognizing that your desire for expansion isn't selfish or unspiritual. It's you remembering your original design, every impulse toward growth, every vision of greater possibility, every moment when you feel called to create something meaningful is divine intelligence trying to express itself through your consciousness. The resistance you feel isn't spiritual wisdom, it's learned limitation, trying to maintain control. This realization has profound implications for how you approach decisions about money, career, relationships, and life. Direction. Instead of asking, "Do I deserve this?" or "Is it spiritual to want this?" the question becomes, "Does this align with my natural expansion?" When you're operating from your authentic programming, abundance flows naturally because you're no longer fighting against your own design. The impact of embracing this divine impulse toward expansion extends far beyond personal circumstances. When someone remembers their original programming and begins operating from natural expansion rather than learned limitation, they become a catalyst for others to remember their own design. Their very presence gives others permission to stop apologizing for their desires and start honoring their authentic nature. Now I want to examine what happens when this natural expansion meets the external world, because understanding how divine programming interfaces with practical reality is crucial for anyone ready to live from their authentic design. Write in the comments, "I remember my original design," if you're ready to stop apologizing for your natural impulse toward expansion. When this divine programming for expansion meets the external world, one of the most profound revelations emerges. The very religious systems that claim to represent divine will have systematically distorted the relationship between spirituality and material abundance. This distortion runs so deep that it's created a complete inversion of actual spiritual teachings. Consider this carefully. Institutional religious systems have spent centuries exalting saints who died of hunger, creating entire mythologies around holy poverty, while conveniently forgetting the most obvious examples that contradict this narrative. The hidden truth that shatters this entire framework becomes clear when you examine what actually happened in these sacred stories. Jesus didn't just talk about abundance, he demonstrated it repeatedly. He multiplied bread to feed thousands, extracted tribute money from fish when needed, and was anointed with expensive perfumes without once reproaching the giver for extravagance. These weren't isolated incidents, they were consistent demonstrations of someone operating from divine connection rather than scarcity consciousness. Behind the scenes of religious institutional control, a deliberate campaign emerged to separate people from these empowering examples while emphasizing stories that supported limitation and dependency. The saints who lived abundantly, who demonstrated divine provision in practical ways, who showed that spiritual connection naturally produces material sufficiency. Their stories were either suppressed, reinterpreted, or overshadowed by narratives that made poverty seem virtuous. This systematic distortion created one of the most effective control mechanisms ever implemented, convincing people that their natural desire for abundance was somehow a betrayal of spiritual values. The impact of this programming has been devastating, creating generations of souls who feel guilty about prosperity, apologetic about success, and convinced that choosing material comfort somehow separates them from divine grace. But recognizing this distortion intellectually isn't enough to create lasting transformation. Here's where most people get stuck. They understand that poverty isn't spiritual. They see through the religious programming. They even agree that abundance is their birthright, but their lived experience remains unchanged. This happens because poverty, as a habit isn't eliminated with knowledge alone. It requires what can only be described as active deprogramming. The journey toward authentic freedom demands understanding that the mind must unlearn what it accepted as truth through sustained exposure to a greater vision. This isn't about reading different books or attending seminars. It's about systematically interrupting the neural pathways that have been carved deep through decades of conditioning. Every time you catch yourself feeling guilty about wanting more, every moment you notice the impulse to diminish your desires, every instance where you automatically limit your vision of what's possible, these are opportunities for active deprogramming. What makes this process so challenging is that the conditioning operates below conscious awareness most of the time. You might intellectually understand that you deserve abundance, but your nervous system still contracts when opportunities appear. Your mind might agree that wealth can be spiritual, but your emotional body still carries programming that associates money with corruption. This internal contradiction creates a state where you're simultaneously wanting and resisting, attracting and repelling, expanding and contracting. The transformation requires more than new information. It demands new experience. The mind that has been programmed to expect limitation needs sustained exposure to evidence that contradicts this programming. This might mean deliberately placing yourself in environments where abundance is normalized, surrounding yourself with people who operate from expansion rather than scarcity, or consistently choosing actions that align with your desired identity rather than your historical patterns. Now I want to explore the specific mechanics of this deprogramming process, because understanding how to systematically interrupt old patterns while installing new ones is essential for anyone serious about permanent transformation rather than temporary improvement. Write in the comments, "I'm ready for active deprogramming," if you understand that intellectual knowledge alone isn't sufficient for this level of transformation. The specific mechanics of this deprogramming process center around developing what can only be described as a new form of spiritual discernment, the ability to recognize in real time what expands versus what contracts your consciousness. This isn't abstract philosophy, it's a practical skill that becomes the foundation for every decision you make. Becoming truly accustomed to God means developing such sensitivity to the movement of life force that you can instantly recognize when something feeds your expansion or when it drains your energy. Here's the hidden truth that changes everything. Everything that doesn't expand your consciousness automatically contracts it. There's no neutral territory. Everything that doesn't actively give life to your soul is unconsciously stealing light from your awareness. This means every thought you entertain that justifies living small, every conversation that reinforces limitation, every environment that normalizes scarcity is actually committing what the text calls infidelity to origin, a betrayal of your fundamental design. Think about the profound implications of this recognition. Every time you catch yourself saying, "I'm being realistic," about a limited situation, you can immediately sense whether this thought expands or contracts your energy. When you notice yourself automatically agreeing with someone's complaint about money being tight, you can feel in real time whether this conversation is feeding your life force or diminishing it. This becomes a moment-by-moment navigation system that guides you toward expansion and away from contraction. Behind the scenes of this process lies one of the most important revelations about human consciousness. The soul doesn't need convincing to expand. It needs deconditioning to stop reducing itself. This completely transforms how you approach personal development. Instead of trying to motivate yourself toward growth, you begin systematically removing the obstacles that prevent your natural expansion from expressing itself. The journey toward authentic freedom reveals why this feels so challenging for most people. When the mind has been domesticated for generations under survival logic, when entire family systems have operated from scarcity consciousness, when cultural programming has made Limitation feels safe and familiar, then expansion doesn't feel like coming home. It feels like betrayal. Your nervous system has been trained to interpret growth as danger, abundance as selfishness, and vision as unrealistic fantasy. What makes this dynamic so insidious is how the domesticated mind creates elaborate justifications for staying small. It convinces you that your limitation is wisdom, that your scarcity is humility, that your smallness is virtue. The conditioned consciousness becomes extremely sophisticated at making contraction feel like the right choice, making you believe you're being responsible, practical, or spiritual when you're actually just obeying inherited programming. The transformation happens when you develop enough sensitivity to feel the difference between authentic guidance and conditioned reaction. Real spiritual wisdom always expands your sense of possibility, even when it suggests waiting or choosing simplicity. Conditioned programming always contracts your energy, even when it promises safety or virtue. The difference isn't in the content of the thought, but in the energetic signature it carries. Understanding this mechanism reveals why so many spiritual practices fail to create lasting transformation. Most approaches try to add new content to the conditioned mind instead of questioning the architecture itself. They teach affirmations to override negative thoughts, visualization to pursue goals, and positive thinking to feel better. But they don't address the fundamental structure that keeps generating contraction. The impact of developing this discernment extends into every area of life. Relationships that once seemed normal reveal themselves as energy drains. Career paths that appeared practical show their limitations clearly. Living situations that felt comfortable expose their capacity to diminish your life force. This isn't about judgment or condemnation, it's about developing the sensitivity to recognize what supports your expansion and what undermines it. Now I want to examine what happens when someone begins consistently choosing expansion over contraction, because understanding the cumulative effect of these micro-decisions is crucial for anyone committed to complete transformation. Write in the comments, "I feel the difference now," if you're beginning to sense what expands versus what contracts your energy in real time. When someone begins consistently choosing expansion over contraction, one of the most profound discoveries emerges: the recognition of how deeply language itself has been weaponized against human potential. This revelation exposes the most sophisticated transmission mechanism of limitation ever created: the inheritance of poverty through language itself. What most people don't realize is that poverty doesn't begin with circumstances. It begins with words, phrases, and expressions that seem completely innocent but operate as hypnotic formulas, programming consciousness for limitation. Think about this carefully. Poverty is inherited first as language, then as conduct, and finally crystallizes as identity. Every family has linguistic patterns that shape reality more powerfully than genetic inheritance. Expressions like, "I'm content with what I have," "money doesn't buy happiness," "we should be grateful for what we've got," or "that's just how life is," aren't wisdom. They're hypnotic formulas of self-limitation, disguised as spiritual or practical insight. The hidden truth that transforms everything is recognizing how these seemingly positive phrases actually function as neural programming. When someone repeatedly says, "I'm content with what I have," they're not expressing genuine satisfaction. They're installing a mental prohibition against expansion. The phrase operates like a subtle command to the subconscious. Do not seek more. Do not expand. Do not allow greater possibilities to enter your awareness. This programming becomes so automatic that the person genuinely believes they're being wise, humble, and spiritually evolved. Behind the scenes of this linguistic conditioning lies an even more devastating mechanism: the colonization of imagination itself. When consciousness has been exposed to limitation language for decades, something catastrophic happens to the creative faculty. Imagination stops being a tool for generating new possibilities and becomes a mechanism for confirming existing limitations. Instead of projecting what hasn't been experienced yet, it begins replicating what always was, effectively preventing the new from being born. This is why so many people struggle to envision lives beyond their current circumstances. Their imagination hasn't been trained to create, it's been conditioned to confirm. When they try to visualize abundance, their mind automatically generates images of struggle. When they attempt to see themselves successful, internal voices immediately catalog all the reasons it won't work. The creative faculty that should be their greatest asset for transformation has been hijacked by habit and turned into a prison guard. The journey toward authentic transformation requires recognizing that most of what passes for realistic thinking is actually colonized imagination in disguise. The voice that says, "Be practical or don't get your hopes up," isn't protecting you from disappointment. It's protecting limitation from disruption. Every time you catch yourself automatically limiting your vision of what's possible, you're witnessing this colonization in action. What makes this dynamic so insidious is how it masquerades as wisdom and maturity. People who have completely colonized imaginations often pride themselves on being realistic, grounded, and sensible. They genuinely believe that their inability to envision greater possibilities demonstrates superior intelligence rather than conditioned limitation. This creates a feedback loop where the very faculty that could liberate them is being used to reinforce their imprisonment. The impact of breaking free from this linguistic and imaginative colonization is immediate and dramatic. When someone begins consciously interrupting limitation language and deliberately exercising their creative imagination beyond the boundaries of current experience, their entire energy field shifts. Possibilities that were literally invisible suddenly become obvious. Opportunities that couldn't be perceived begin appearing everywhere. Understanding this mechanism reveals why traditional positive thinking approaches often fail. They try to overlay optimistic language on top of colonized imagination without addressing the fundamental structure. The result is internal conflict between surface affirmations and deeper programming, creating the exhausting experience of trying to convince yourself of something your imagination can't actually picture. Now I want to explore how this colonized imagination specifically operates in relationship to money and material abundance, because understanding these patterns is essential for anyone ready to reclaim their authentic creative power. Write in the comments, "My imagination is colonized," if you recognize how your creative faculty has been limited by inherited language patterns. How this colonized imagination specifically operates in relationship to money reveals one of the most profound secrets about manifestation and abundance creation. The hidden truth that most people never discover is that internal negation is infinitely more powerful than any external condition in determining what becomes possible in your life. The ancient wisdom captured this perfectly. Everything not expected from the divine source is already negated in the heart. This internal negation operates below conscious awareness, functioning as the strongest decree vibrating silently in your psyche. Think about the staggering implications of this revelation. You might consciously desire financial freedom, actively visualize abundance, and even take practical steps toward wealth creation. But if your heart has already decreed that such abundance isn't meant for you, that invisible negation will override every external effort. The psyche contains mechanisms so powerful that they can neutralize years of hard work, brilliant strategies, and even fortunate circumstances simply through the silent operation of internal prohibition. Behind the scenes of this internal negation lies a transmission Systems so sophisticated that it makes genetic inheritance look primitive by comparison. Families transmit mental codes of scarcity with the same precision they transmit recipes, etiquette rules, and cultural traditions. These aren't occasional lessons. They're daily downloads of limitation programming disguised as love, protection, and practical wisdom. What appears to be caring guidance is actually the installation of perceptual filters that will govern financial reality for decades. The journey toward understanding this mechanism reveals something most people aren't prepared to face. Poverty isn't an imposed curse from external forces. It's a carefully inherited narrative disguised as protection. Parents who struggle financially don't just model limitation through their circumstances. They transmit the emotional, mental, and energetic patterns that created those circumstances. Children absorb not just the visible effects of scarcity, but the invisible architecture that generates scarcity. What makes this transmission so effective is how it operates through what appears to be love and concern. When a parent tells a child, "Don't get your hopes up, money doesn't grow on trees," or "We can't afford that," they genuinely believe they're protecting that child from disappointment and teaching practical wisdom. In reality, they're installing neural pathways that will automatically generate limitation for decades. The child learns not just about current financial constraints, but about what's possible for people like them. The impact of this inherited programming extends far beyond conscious beliefs or attitudes about money. It shapes the very frequency at which someone vibrates, determining what opportunities they can perceive, what possibilities they can imagine, and what actions they feel capable of taking. The mental codes inherited from family systems don't just influence thoughts about money. They create the energetic signature that either attracts or repels abundance. Understanding this transmission mechanism explains why financial transformation is so challenging, even for people with strong motivation and good strategies. They're not just working against current circumstances, they're working against generational patterns that have been reinforced through thousands of interactions over many years. The inherited codes operate like invisible software, automatically generating thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that recreate familiar financial patterns. The most profound recognition in this process is discovering that the internal negation isn't personal failure. It's inherited conditioning that can be identified and transformed. When someone realizes that their inability to imagine financial abundance isn't evidence of realism, but evidence of programming, everything changes. The limitation stops feeling like truth and starts feeling like a costume they've been wearing unconsciously. Now I want to explore the specific techniques for identifying and interrupting these inherited mental codes, because understanding how to locate and dissolve generational programming is essential for anyone committed to creating financial reality beyond their family's historical patterns. Write in the comments, "I inherited these codes," if you're beginning to recognize how family programming has shaped your relationship with money and possibility. The specific techniques for identifying these inherited mental codes begin with understanding one of the most heartbreaking dynamics in human development, the creation of what can only be described as the fragmented child. This isn't a psychological disorder. It's the natural result of growing up between two conflicting forces that tear the developing consciousness apart. Children inherently grow between two fires, their intuition constantly telling them they deserve more, and their environment systematically training them to adjust to less. This fundamental conflict doesn't resolve as they mature. It crystallizes into perpetual tension and guilt over the very act of desiring. Think about the profound psychological damage this creates. Every child begins life with an unshakable knowing that abundance is their birthright, that possibilities are limitless, that they're meant for greatness. This isn't naive optimism, it's accurate perception of their divine design. but simultaneously they're being educated through hundreds of daily interactions that this knowing is wrong, unrealistic, and potentially dangerous. The result isn't wisdom, it's fragmentation between what they feel is true and what they're taught to accept as reality. Behind the scenes of this developmental process, something even more sophisticated emerges. Every scarcity mentality that takes hold creates a complete ritual structure to sustain itself. This isn't just about individual beliefs. It's about entire social systems organized around limitation. There are symbols that reinforce poverty consciousness, emotions that bond people through shared struggle, habits that maintain limitation, and relationships that depend on everyone staying small. The impact extends far beyond personal psychology into the architecture of social connection itself. The hidden truth that most people never recognize is how many of their friendships and community connections actually depend on keeping desire dormant. There are relationships that can only survive if everyone agrees to complain about money together, social circles that bond through shared limitation, and entire communities whose cohesion depends on what could be called poverty agreements, unspoken contracts that no one will expand beyond the group's comfort zone. This revelation exposes one of the most challenging aspects of authentic transformation. Breaking free from limitation often means disrupting social systems that have been organized around shared scarcity. When someone begins genuinely expanding, genuinely prospering, genuinely breaking through inherited limitations, they discover that many of their relationships were actually built on mutual commitment to staying small. The person who was supported when they were struggling suddenly finds themselves isolated when they're succeeding. The journey toward authentic freedom requires recognizing how deeply embedded these ritual structures become in daily life. The language patterns that reinforce limitation aren't occasional, they're constant. The emotional bonding through shared struggle isn't circumstantial, it's systematic. The habits that maintain poverty consciousness aren't accidental. They're precisely designed to create comfort through familiarity with limitation. Even the identity itself becomes organized around being someone who doesn't have much, doesn't expect much, and doesn't disrupt others by wanting more. Understanding this mechanism reveals why individual transformation work often hits invisible walls. You can change your mindset, upgrade your skills, and even alter your circumstances. But if you haven't addressed the social ritual structures that reinforce limitation, you'll find yourself unconsciously recreating familiar patterns. The resistance isn't just internal, it's relational, cultural, and systemic. What makes this dynamic so insidious is how it masquerades as virtue, loyalty, and humility. People who maintain these poverty agreements often genuinely believe they're being good friends, responsible community members, and spiritually evolved individuals. They don't recognize that their commitment to shared limitation is actually a form of mutual imprisonment disguised as solidarity. The most profound shift occurs when someone develops enough awareness to see these ritual structures clearly and make conscious decisions about which ones truly serve their expansion and which ones maintain limitation through social pressure. Now I want to explore what happens when someone begins deliberately disrupting these social agreements around poverty, because understanding the mechanics of conscious relationship transformation is crucial for anyone serious about sustained abundance. Write in the comments, "I see the ritual structures," if you're recognizing how your social connections have been organized around shared limitation patterns. What happens when someone begins deliberately disrupting these social agreements around poverty reveals one of the most profound secrets about how reality itself is constructed. This isn't metaphorical. It's describing the actual mechanics of manifestation that most people never understand. The hidden truth that changes everything is recognizing that the world was literally created through combinations of letters, numbers, and forms. Reality is structured symbolically, which means the words you use, the numbers you accept as normal, and the mental forms you sustain create the invisible net upon which all your experiences manifest. Think about the staggering implications of this revelation. Every conversation you participate in is either reinforcing the symbolic structure of limitation or contributing to the creation of expansion. When you engage in discussions about how expensive everything is, how hard it is to make money, or how impossible certain dreams seem, you're not just expressing opinions. You're participating in the symbolic construction of a reality where those conditions remain true. The language itself becomes a creative force, weaving the very experiences you then encounter. Behind the scenes of this symbolic creation process lies the mechanism that makes breakthrough possible. Every individual who has ever broken free from chronic poverty, every person who has transcended their inherited limitations, every soul who has moved from scarcity to abundance has done so because at some crucial moment they were allowed to see something different. That vision, that glimpse of possibility beyond their current reality, breaks the continuity of the habitual and opens a crack in the symbolic structure they've been unconsciously maintaining. The journey toward authentic transformation reveals why these moments of original vision are so rare and so powerful. Most people live their entire lives within the symbolic boundaries they inherited, never questioning whether the words they use, the numbers they accept, or the mental forms they sustain actually serve their expansion. They participate in conversations that reinforce limitation, accept financial parameters that feel normal to their family background, and maintain mental images that confirm rather than challenge their current circumstances. What makes original vision so transformative is how it interrupts the automatic symbolic creation process. When someone suddenly sees beyond their inherited limitations, whether through inspiration, necessity, encounter with someone living differently, or moment of inner knowing, something shifts in the fundamental architecture of their reality. The symbols that once seemed fixed become fluid. The words that once felt like truth reveal themselves as choices. The numbers that once seemed immutable show their malleability. Understanding this mechanism explains why environmental change can be so powerful for transformation. When someone deliberately places themselves in environments where different symbols are normal, where different language patterns predominate, where different numerical realities are taken for granted, they're not just changing their surroundings, they're exposing themselves to different reality creation processes. The impact isn't just inspirational, it's structural, affecting the very foundation upon which their experiences manifest. The most profound realization in this process is discovering that the symbolic structure of your reality isn't something that happens to you. It's something you're continuously participating in creating. Every word, choice, every numerical expectation, every mental form you entertain is either contributing to the reinforcement of limitation or the construction of possibility. This recognition transforms every moment of communication from passive participation into conscious creation. What's fascinating about this process is how quickly symbolic shifts can alter actual circumstances. When someone begins consciously choosing language that assumes abundance rather than reinforces scarcity, when they start accepting numbers that stretch their comfort zone rather than confirm their limitations, when they deliberately sustain mental forms that expand rather than contract their vision, the changes in their external experience can be surprisingly rapid. Now, I want to explore exactly how to cultivate and sustain these moments of original vision, because understanding the mechanics of breakthrough perception is essential for anyone committed to permanent transformation rather than temporary. Inspiration. Write in the comments, "I create through symbols," if you're beginning to recognize how your words and mental forms are actively constructing your reality. Exactly how to cultivate and sustain these moments of original vision requires understanding one of the most revolutionary insights about the nature of existence itself. What most people accept as immutable reality is actually nothing more than collective habit disguised as objective fact. This recognition changes everything, because it means what we call reality is only our habit, and what we call impossible is only what we haven't allowed ourselves to imagine. The impossible isn't an objective boundary imposed by the universe. It's a mental decision that becomes so automatic we forget we're making it. Think about the profound implications of this revelation. Every limitation you've accepted as just how things are, whether about money, relationships, health, or possibilities, exists only because enough people have agreed to maintain the same perceptual habits. The boundaries that feel so solid, so real, so permanent are actually collective decisions that could be changed if enough consciousness shifted. What seems like hard reality is actually soft consensus that's been repeated until it appears fixed. Behind the scenes of this habit-based reality construction lies one of the most devastating forms of spiritual violation, what can only be described as the soul's betrayal of its own divine heritage. This isn't dramatic language. It's describing a precise spiritual mechanism. Poverty, in its deepest sense, is a falsification of lineage, an internal betrayal of the spiritual inheritance that every soul carries. Every time a human being grows accustomed to living with less than their soul intuitively knows is possible, they commit what the text calls invisible apostasy, a betrayal of their divine nature that happens gradually, silently, almost imperceptibly. The journey toward understanding this betrayal reveals how sophisticated the mechanism of spiritual amnesia has become. Most people don't wake up one day and decide to reject their divine heritage. Instead, they make thousands of tiny accommodations to limitation, each one seeming reasonable, practical, and necessary. They accept a job that doesn't fulfill them because they need to pay bills. They settle for relationships that don't inspire them because something is better than nothing. They abandon dreams that once felt essential because pursuing them seems unrealistic. What makes this spiritual betrayal so insidious is how it masquerades as maturity, responsibility, and wisdom. The soul that has learned to live with less than it knows is possible doesn't feel like it's betraying anything. It feels like it's being practical, realistic, and appropriately humble. The internal voice that once called for expansion gets reinterpreted as naive idealism, youthful fantasy, or dangerous delusion. Understanding this mechanism reveals why breakthrough moments are often accompanied by such intense emotion. When someone suddenly sees beyond their habitual limitations, when they glimpse what's actually possible rather than what they've been conditioned to accept, they're not just experiencing inspiration, they're remembering their authentic nature. The tears that often accompany these recognitions aren't just joy, they're grief for all the years spent living below their actual design. The impact of recognizing reality as habit rather than fact transforms every aspect of existence. Decisions that once seemed impossible become obvious choices. Limitations that once felt permanent reveal their arbitrary nature. The entire framework through which someone interprets their experience shifts from "this is how things are" to "this is how things have been maintained" through collective agreement. The most profound aspect of this recognition is discovering that changing reality doesn't require fighting against objective conditions. It requires changing the perceptual habits that construct those conditions. When someone stops automatically accepting inherited limitations as truth, when they begin questioning what they've always assumed was fixed, when they start imagining beyond the boundaries of their habitual perception, the external world begins responding to these internal shifts with surprising consistency. Now I want to explore the specific process of reclaiming this. Divine heritage, because understanding how to consciously restore your original spiritual lineage is essential for anyone ready to stop living below their authentic design. Write in the comments, "I recognize the betrayal," if you're seeing how you've unconsciously abandoned your soul's knowing of what's possible. The specific process of reclaiming this divine heritage begins with confronting one of the most uncomfortable theological contradictions in modern spiritual understanding. If human beings truly bear the image of the divine, and virtually every spiritual tradition affirms this in some form, then that image should express itself not only in interior experiences of connection, but in the concrete configuration of their actual lives. The hidden truth that most religious teaching avoids is this: sustained misery cannot be an authentic expression of the eternal. Chronic scarcity contradicts the very nature of what it claims to reflect. Think about the profound implications of this theological framework. If you genuinely carry divine essence, if your consciousness is truly connected to infinite creative potential, if your soul actually participates in the nature of the source itself, then a life of persistent limitation isn't humility, it's contradiction. It's like a ray of sunlight apologizing for being bright, or a river feeling guilty for flowing toward the ocean. The sustained acceptance of less than what your divine nature knows is possible becomes not just personal limitation but spiritual incoherence. Behind the scenes of this contradiction lies the mechanism through which most people gradually abandon their heritage without ever realizing what's happening. The betrayal of divine lineage doesn't occur through dramatic rejection or conscious rebellion. It installs itself through an accumulation of small decisions that seem reasonable in isolation but collectively construct a logic of divine limitation. Each compromise appears insignificant, but together they create an architecture of consciousness that systematically excludes divine possibility. The journey toward understanding this process reveals how devastatingly subtle the installation of limitation can be. Someone accepts an unjust wage because they need the job, telling themselves it's temporary while unconsciously programming their nervous system to expect inadequate compensation. They limit legitimate desires from fear of appearing greedy, gradually training their imagination to operate within artificially narrow boundaries. They silence expansive visions because criticism feels unbearable, slowly conditioning their creative faculty to generate only safe, small possibilities. What makes this gradual limitation so insidious is how each decision feels practical, responsible, and wise in the moment. The person making these choices doesn't experience them as spiritual betrayal. They experience them as mature adaptation to reality. They genuinely believe they're being sensible when they're actually participating in the systematic construction of a life that contradicts their divine nature. Understanding this mechanism reveals why breakthrough often feels like remembering rather than learning something new. When someone suddenly sees beyond their accumulated limitations, when they recognize the artificial nature of constraints they've accepted as natural, when they glimpse what becomes possible when divine nature is allowed to express itself practically, they're not discovering foreign territory, they're returning to their original design. The impact of recognizing these small decisions as spiritual choices rather than practical necessities transforms the entire experience of daily life. Every moment becomes an opportunity to either reinforce limitation or express divine nature. Every choice about work, relationships, living situations, and financial decisions becomes a declaration about spiritual identity rather than just practical management. What's most profound about this recognition is discovering that reclaiming divine heritage doesn't require dramatic gestures or heroic transformations. It requires the consistent choice to align small decisions with divine nature, rather than inherited limitation. Each time someone refuses to accept unjust compensation, each moment they honor rather than silence expansive vision, each decision to embrace rather than limit legitimate desire becomes an act of spiritual restoration. Now, I want to explore what happens when someone begins consistently making these alignment choices, because understanding the cumulative effect of divine decision-making is crucial for anyone ready to live from their authentic spiritual identity. Write in the comments, "I see the small betrayals," if you're recognizing how daily compromises have gradually constructed limitation in your life. What happens when someone begins consistently making these alignment choices reveals one of the most beautiful and profound metaphors for spiritual transformation ever articulated. The cumulative effect of divine decision-making operates like the difference between flowing water and stagnant pools, like stagnant water that loses its ability to reflect light. Not because the light doesn't exist, but because movement has stopped. Souls that cease moving toward expansion lose their divine reflection through their own stillness. This isn't punishment from external forces. It's the natural consequence of choosing stagnation over flow. Think about the profound accuracy of this image. Water that moves constantly reflects the sky with brilliant clarity, dancing with light, sparkling with life. But when that same water stops moving, when it becomes still and stagnant, it gradually loses its reflective capacity. The surface becomes clouded, the clarity disappears, and what once mirrored heaven now only shows murky depth. This is precisely what happens to consciousness when it stops moving toward expansion, when it settles into comfortable limitation, when it chooses safety over growth. Behind the scenes of this spiritual stagnation lies one of the most crucial misunderstandings about the nature of abundance itself. The journey toward authentic transformation reveals that abundance isn't about having more things, accumulating more wealth, or acquiring more possessions. This recognition completely revolutionizes how someone approaches their relationship with material reality. True abundance is alignment with totality, a state of consciousness that can manifest through any external circumstances while maintaining internal coherence with infinite creative potential. The hidden truth that transforms everything is understanding that the abundant soul can live with little or much, but never with fear. This isn't about the quantity of possessions or the size of bank accounts. It's about the quality of consciousness that interfaces with material reality. The person operating from authentic abundance can receive gifts, opportunities, and resources without guilt because they understand these aren't rewards for personal worthiness, but expressions of natural flow. They can desire expansion, growth, and greater possibilities without shame because they recognize these impulses as divine nature expressing itself through human consciousness. What makes this understanding so revolutionary is how it dissolves the false choice between spirituality and material well-being that has tormented seekers for centuries. When someone recognizes abundance as alignment rather than accumulation, they stop needing to choose between connection to source and practical prosperity. They can pursue financial success without losing spiritual connection because their success becomes an expression of that connection rather than a departure from it. The impact of operating from this aligned abundance extends far beyond personal circumstances. When someone embodies this quality of consciousness, their very presence becomes a demonstration that scarcity and spirituality were never authentically connected. They show others through their lived example that it's possible to be deeply connected to Source while also being materially prosperous. The divine connection actually enhances rather than diminishes practical capability. Understanding this mechanism explains why so many traditional approaches to abundance creation fail to produce lasting results. They focus on accumulation strategies rather than alignment practices, on getting more rather than becoming clear. When someone operates from misalignment, trying to manifest abundance while still carrying fear, guilt, or shame about desire, they create internal contradictions that sabotage their external efforts. The most profound shift occurs when someone realizes that authentic abundance work isn't about changing their external circumstances first and hoping their internal state will follow. It's about achieving internal alignment with totality and allowing that alignment to naturally organize external circumstances in harmony with their expanded consciousness. Now I want to explore the practical mechanics of maintaining this alignment in daily life, because understanding how to sustain divine reflection while navigating ordinary challenges is essential for anyone committed to embodying authentic abundance. Write in the comments, "I choose movement over stagnation," if you're ready to keep your consciousness flowing toward expansion rather than settling into comfortable limitation. The practical mechanics of maintaining this alignment in daily life require confronting one of the most devastating distortions in spiritual teaching, the complete misinterpretation of what humility actually means. Few words in the entire spiritual vocabulary have been as thoroughly corrupted as humility, which has been transformed from an inner quality, expressing vibrational accuracy between soul and origin, into an external dogma of forced resignation and systematic desire condemnation. This distortion has created more spiritual damage than perhaps any other single misunderstanding. Think about the profound impact this has had on consciousness development. True humility isn't about making yourself small, apologizing for your desires, or pretending you don't want expansion. Authentic humility is the accurate recognition of your actual relationship to Source, understanding that you're a channel for divine expression, not the generator of it. This recognition doesn't diminish you, it reveals your true magnitude. It doesn't eliminate desire, it purifies desire by connecting it to its divine origin. Behind the scenes of this massive distortion lies one of the most revolutionary insights about the nature of desire itself. What most people have been taught to suppress, control, or feel guilty about is actually the mechanism through which divine intelligence operates in human consciousness. According to the great mystic Ibn Arabi, what we call desire is simply the name that truth takes when it wants to manifest through us. This completely transforms how we understand the impulse toward expansion, creation, and abundance. The hidden truth that changes everything is recognizing that desire isn't an inferior force that needs to be transcended. It's divine presence operating in human form as a call toward greater expression. When you feel the impulse to create something meaningful, when you envision possibilities beyond your current circumstances, when you're drawn toward expansion and growth, you're not experiencing personal ambition or ego-driven wanting. You're experiencing divine intelligence, using your consciousness as a vehicle for its own creative expression. The journey toward understanding this mechanism reveals why so many spiritual practices that focus on eliminating desire actually create spiritual stagnation. They're trying to silence the very faculty through which the divine communicates with human consciousness. Instead of purifying desire by connecting it to its source, they're attempting to eliminate the communication channel itself. The result isn't enlightenment, it's disconnection disguised as transcendence. What makes this recognition so transformative is how it reframes every moment of authentic wanting as a sacred communication. When you desire financial freedom, when you envision creating something beautiful, when you feel called toward greater impact or influence, you're not being selfish or unspiritual. You're receiving divine instruction about what wants to emerge through your life. The challenge isn't to eliminate these impulses, but to learn how to receive them clearly without the interference of ego distortion. Understanding this principle transforms the entire approach to abundance creation. Instead of trying to manifest what you think you want, you begin learning how to receive what divine intelligence wants to create through you. This shift in perspective eliminates the struggle, the forcing, and the anxiety that characterizes most approaches to personal development. When you recognize yourself as a channel for divine creativity, rather than a separate individual trying to get something from the universe, everything becomes easier. The impact of operating from this understanding extends into every area of life. Decisions become clearer because you're not trying to figure out what you should want. You're learning to recognize what wants to emerge. Creativity flows more naturally because you're not generating ideas from personal effort. You're receiving inspiration from source. Financial abundance manifests more consistently because you're not trying to accumulate resources for personal security. You're allowing divine provision to flow through you toward its intended expression. Now I want to explore the specific techniques for distinguishing between authentic divine desire and ego-driven wanting, because understanding this difference is crucial for anyone serious about becoming a clear channel for divine creativity. Write in the comments, "Desire is divine communication," if you're beginning to recognize your authentic impulses as sacred guidance rather than personal ambition. The specific techniques for distinguishing between authentic divine desire and ego-driven wanting require understanding how profoundly physical this entire process actually is. What most people don't realize is that chronic scarcity doesn't remain as abstract mental concepts. It descends into the body, adheres to physical tissue, imprints itself in the energy field, lodges in the nervous system, and eventually fixes itself in what can only be described as the soul's vibrational architecture. These aren't metaphorical structures, they're invisible but very real forms that shape how energy moves through your entire being. Think about the profound implications of this embodied programming. Every time you've accepted limitation, every moment you've resigned yourself to less than what felt possible, every instance where you've suppressed authentic desire, your body has been recording and storing these experiences. Your nervous system has been learning to contract when expansion appears. Your energy field has been programmed to resist abundance, and your cellular memory has been encoded with patterns that automatically recreate familiar limitation. Behind the scenes of this embodied conditioning lies one of the most important revelations about the nature of matter itself. The original design wasn't for material reality to dominate consciousness, but for matter to serve as a vehicle of expression for divine intelligence. Gold, money, possessions, and all forms of material abundance were never meant to be masters that consciousness serves. They were designed to be symbols and extensions of invisible creative power made visible in form. The journey toward understanding this original design reveals how completely the relationship between spirit and matter has been inverted in modern consciousness. The error isn't in possessing goods, accumulating wealth, or enjoying material comfort. The error is in forgetting matter's original function as the visible extension of the invisible. When someone operates from this inverted understanding, they either worship material things as if they were the source of power, or they reject material things as if they were obstacles to spiritual connection. What makes this inversion so devastating is how it creates internal conflict at the cellular level. When someone believes that wanting material abundance makes them less spiritual, their body develops actual allergic reactions to prosperity. When they think that having money corrupts their connection to source, their nervous system learns to associate financial success with danger. The result is a form of embodied contradiction, where the soul desires expansion while the body has been programmed to resist it. Understanding this mechanism explains why purely mental approaches to abundance creation often fail. You can change your thoughts, upgrade your beliefs, and practice positive visualization, but if your body is still carrying decades of embodied limitation programming, it will unconsciously sabotage your conscious efforts. The nervous system that has been trained to contract when opportunities appear will override the mind that wants to expand. The transformation requires working with the body as an active participant in consciousness change, rather than just a passive container for mental processes. This means learning to recognize how limitation feels in your physical being, the subtle contractions that happen when you consider bigger possibilities, the way your breathing becomes shallow when you imagine greater abundance, the tension that appears in specific body parts when you envision expansion beyond your comfort zone. The impact of addressing this embodied programming can be immediate and dramatic. When someone begins consciously releasing the physical patterns that maintain limitation, when they start retraining their nervous system to associate expansion with safety rather than danger, when they restore matter to its original function as divine symbol rather than spiritual obstacle, their entire capacity for receiving abundance transforms. What's most profound about this work is discovering that the body wants to support expansion. It's only learned to resist because it was programmed to protect against what seemed like danger. When the programming is updated, when the nervous system understands that abundance serves rather than threatens spiritual connection, the same physical intelligence that once created limitation becomes a powerful ally in manifestation. Now, I want to explore the specific practices for reprogramming this embodied architecture, because understanding how to transform limitation patterns at the cellular level is essential for anyone committed to sustainable abundance. Write in the comments, "I feel it in my body," if you're recognizing how limitation has been physically encoded in your nervous system and energy field. The specific practices for reprogramming this embodied architecture reveal one of the most sophisticated traps in modern spiritual development, what could be called the new idolatry of wealth without soul. While ancient consciousness struggled with compulsive renunciation of material abundance, modern souls seem to have overcome ancestral scarcity only to fall into an equally distorted pattern: compulsive affirmation of abundance without genuine spiritual foundation. Desire has been liberated from old religious constraints, but it hasn't been redeemed through authentic divine connection. Consciousness has been empowered with manifestation techniques, but it hasn't been rectified through surrender to higher purpose. Think about how subtle and sophisticated this new spiritual trap has become. The contemporary seeker learns to affirm abundance, visualize prosperity, and declare their worthiness of wealth. But these practices often operate from the same separated ego that once drove compulsive renunciation. The language has changed from "I don't deserve abundance" to "I am abundant," but the fundamental orientation remains self-focused rather than source-connected. The result is spiritual materialism disguised as enlightened manifestation. Behind the scenes of this modern distortion lies a crucial misunderstanding about the ultimate purpose of abundance work. Most approaches treat prosperity as an end goal rather than recognizing it as a natural byproduct of spiritual alignment. They focus on getting rather than becoming, on accumulating rather than embodying, on manifesting outcomes rather than expressing authentic nature. This creates what appears to be spiritual success, but actually represents a more sophisticated form of spiritual immaturity. The journey toward authentic transformation reveals that there's a point in genuine spiritual development where all seeking eventually stops, not because something external was finally found, but because the internal need to find anything outside oneself completely dissolves. This isn't the end of growth or expansion, it's the beginning of operating from what can only be described as divine certainty rather than human faith. It's the vibrational stability that emerges when a soul has assumed its only authentic identity as divine expression in human form. What makes this state so radically different from both traditional scarcity consciousness and modern abundance seeking is that it operates from complete sufficiency. The person who has become truly accustomed to God doesn't need to affirm abundance because they embody it naturally. They don't need to visualize prosperity because they operate as a channel for divine provision. They don't need to declare their worthiness because they've transcended the entire framework of worthiness and unworthiness. Understanding this ultimate destination transforms how someone approaches every aspect of abundance work. Instead of trying to get God to give them what they want, they learn to become so aligned with divine nature that what they need simply appears as natural consequence. Instead of working to deserve abundance, they work to become clear enough channels that abundance can flow through them without obstruction. Instead of seeking to accumulate wealth, they seek to embody the consciousness from which true wealth naturally emanates. The impact of reaching this level of integration extends far beyond personal prosperity. Someone operating from this divine certainty becomes a demonstration of what's possible when human consciousness remembers its true nature. Their very presence gives others permission to stop seeking abundance outside themselves and start recognizing it as their natural inheritance. They become living proof that scarcity was always an illusion, and that abundance is simply what happens when consciousness operates from its original design. What's most profound about this state is how effortless it becomes. The person accustomed to God doesn't struggle with abundance because they're not separate from its source. They don't work to manifest because they've become the manifestation of divine creativity itself. They don't seek prosperity because they've discovered they are prosperity expressing itself in human form. Exactly what it means to live from this level of divine certainty in practical terms becomes clear when you recognize that everything we've explored together in this conversation has been leading to one simple recognition. You were never separate from the abundance you've been seeking. The techniques, the insights, the revelations about programming and limitation, all of this points toward the moment when seeking stops because you remember what you actually are. If you've stayed with me through this entire exploration, if these ideas have resonated with something deep in your consciousness, if you feel like you've been hearing truths you already knew but had forgotten, then you're exactly where you need to be. This isn't just information, it's activation. Each concept we've discussed has been designed to shake loose the programming that keeps divine nature hidden behind inherited limitation. The fact that you're still here, still listening, still open to these radical ideas about abundance and spiritual identity tells me you're ready for the real work. You're part of a consciousness that's waking up to its authentic nature, remembering its divine inheritance and choosing expansion over the comfortable familiarity of limitation. That's exactly why I create these conversations, for souls like yours who refuse to settle for less than their true design. If this message has touched something real in you, if you've felt the recognition of truth throughout our time together, I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel. These aren't just videos, they're transmissions designed to support your journey back to authentic spiritual abundance. Every conversation we share here is crafted to help consciousness remember what it really is. And if you've made it all the way to this moment, if you've stayed present through this entire exploration of what it means to become accustomed to God, write in the comments, "This message was meant for me." That's simple. A phrase lets me know you received what was intended, that something in your soul recognized itself in these words. The like button isn't just a metric, it's your way of saying yes to this frequency, yes to this level of conversation, yes to content that treats your consciousness with the respect it deserves. When you hit that like, you're supporting not just this video, but the entire intention behind creating content that serves genuine spiritual awakening rather than spiritual entertainment. There's a video right here that takes this conversation even deeper, exploring exactly how to maintain this divine certainty when the world around you still operates from limitation. Click and continue with me over there. The journey we've started together is just beginning to unfold.